There's a long history. In the beginning, it was terrible. Like, we'd sign a treaty and then walk all over it.
With the government, they don't really necessarily have to abide by the same state laws, but they do have to abide by the federal laws because they're their own sovereign nation within the state.
The U.S. government would tell them things and then take them away.
Reservations are sovereign nations, so we pretty much govern ourselves. And if something's like pushing it, I guess sometimes the government comes in and deal with it.
They don't always abide by the same laws that the rest of the state has to.
Indian cultures got all of their land taken away and then they got shoved onto reservations, so there's some tension there.
I'm not very sure what the relationship between the government and the Native American tribes are, but the last thing I've heard is it wasn't, well, I'm just going to say I don't really know for sure what the relationship is.
When the United States annexed Montana lands in the 19th century, it imposed federal laws on the newly acquired property and the people on those lands. Despite tens of thousands of years that Native peoples already lived in Montana, the United States government dictated Indian policy. Treaties, executive orders, congressional legislation created that policy. American Indians fought this alien system in the Indian Wars of the 19th century. Federal Indian policy alternately attempted to isolate Indians on reservations, inadvertently preserving their culture, and to assimilate Indians into Euro-American population. In yet another strategy, some legislation made Indians wards of the federal government. The life experiences of each Montana Indian can be understood only by recognizing the ever-changing federal Indian policies. Since white settlers first came to the land now known as Montana, they have created laws to restrict and regulate the lives of American Indians who came before. The policies of the 20th century were meant to assimilate and educate Indians into new white ways, tearing away their culture and traditions in the process. The termination policy of the 50s were successfully fought by Montana tribes and their supporters. The second half of the 20th century saw enormous cultural struggle. By sharing the story of one Montana family, the Junos of Browning, we get a glimpse of how the policies of the 20th century shaped their lives.
I was born and raised in Browning, which is headquarters for the Blackfeet Indian tribe. But after high school, I had asked a couple of my teachers which college I should go to, and they told me that I wasn't academically prepared to go to college, and so I should go to a vocational school. So I had an older brother that had gone to Haskell, and it seemed like just everybody from on the reservation at one time or another had gone to Haskell, so I just followed suit and did the same thing.
At that time, in the early 60s, it was a BIA vocational training school for American Indians.
I switched to the business curriculum, and 2 years later graduated from the general business department and went on relocation out to Oakland, California. And then that's when I met Carol. I think if you look back, just before the relocation program started, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had their termination policy to try to terminate tribes, to try to get them in to become part of the melting pot of America. But that didn't work. There was such a massive outcry from Indian tribes, and they had the support of churches and a lot of other people that the government had to change that policy. And so when they changed it, they came up with the idea, well, let's just relocate them all.
It was a BIA program, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in the 50s, 60s, decided that one of the solutions to assist Indian people was to take them from reservation communities and move them into the urban areas, provide them perhaps with some training, or perhaps help them just go right to employment. Cities are difficult for anybody, I think, just moving into a city and moving into that environment.
We weren't prepared for how you live in a city and how you have to take public transportation. When I first started riding buses, they give me this transfer, and I'd take the transfer and didn't know what it was. So I'd ride, and pretty soon I'd get on another bus and I'd throw another token in there to give me another transfer, and I'd take that and didn't know what it was. But nobody explained those types of things to us. So a lot of little things like that we just had to learn on our own.
I'm sure in employment at that time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was directing us so under the relocation program to various places and to just certain types of jobs that went from a situation in reservation communities where we were unemployed but went into a city finding public service jobs, probably many low-paying jobs, and so we became poor in the city basically. Some areas would rent to us, some areas wouldn't. It's the old story of you see an apartment for rent, but by the time you get there, and call and when you get there, it's sorry, it's already been rented. And I guess at that time, you didn't know how to fight that. You didn't know that there was places you could go, or there maybe wasn't places you could go at that time to ask about that.
When they moved us from the reservations to the cities, I think one of the underlying things was to destroy the culture and the language and the history, and the relocation cities, as we found each other, that became even stronger, became more important. Even though the people that we associated with on weekends might have been from other tribes, we kind of created like almost an urban Indian tribe. And so I think that the language and the culture and the dances and all that is even more alive now and more important to Indian people now than it probably was even before we started it. In hindsight, very little of it worked.
I definitely think that the relocation policy has affected my generation and subsequent generations of Indian people, because people were on relocation in cities, meeting people of different tribes, getting married, having children who are then this mix of Indian people. And so I would say if you look amongst my generation, it's probably a true mix of different tribes from all across the United States being in one person.
When we lived in Oakland, California, it was a different time in America as well. We lived in the cities, during the growth of the Vietnam War. The Oakland, California area was experiencing lots of things, and America was experiencing lots of things, and the American Indian movement was beginning to rise, and so I do think the influence of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in our reservation communities kept our tribal communities a little more afraid, I guess, to maybe speak out, a little more hesitant to speak out.
You had the Black Panthers and you had the Chicanos and all those. Well, we had the American Indian movement, and I think it did a lot to let us know that we were Indians and we could be proud, and and we could demand, and we had leaders that were out in the front that were willing to put their life on the line to make sure that that happened.
The theme was Indian power. 2 words define what that movement worked towards. And when someone begins to want a little bit of your power that you've had before or you've exercised over a group of people, and they say we want some of that back, or we want to have that ourselves, surely, people get very uncomfortable with that. Any social change has that time of kind of upheaval. The American Indian movement was probably necessary for that time of change.
I think the publicity they were getting in the media worldwide was of a very big concern to the federal government, because if they weren't fulfilling their treaties to American Indians in America, how is that going to affect the treaties that they have with other countries? So I think that with our having treaties and exposing the parts of the treaties that were being ignored by the government was very, very worrisome to a lot of people.
In the early 70s, after the takeover of Washington, the BIA in Washington, D.C., after the longest walk, all of the various things that the American Indian movement did, a lot of probably pieces of legislation were passed. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed. The Indian Education Act of 1972 was passed. I think the government stood up and took notice and began to create legislation and pass legislation that tried to provide more power to Indian people.
When I moved back to Browning, the superintendent at that time visited with me about being a counselor at the high school. I was concerned that 98% of the enrollment were Indian kids, but I was about the only certified Indian person working in the school. Kids, when they enter that school, have to see a reflection of themselves. In a lot of our public schools, that's not happening. As a counselor, I was able to work with kids on a daily basis. Start taking a lot of kids to a lot of college campuses where they could see different occupations, different professional areas and stuff. And then those that went into education, whenever I would go to one of the cities like Missoula or Bozeman or Billings or someplace like that, I'd always go to those campuses and find those people who were in education and encourage them to continue and then to come back and teach.
It doesn't matter who you are, you want your family to do well, you want to be able to fit in, you want to be able to belong, you want to be able to have power and prestige, you want to be able to have all those things, and I think those are common among humanity no matter who you are. But I also think Indians bring along that entire history. They know where they've been, they know what has happened to them in this country. I think it's very, very important, particularly within the educational realm, that people understand and Indian students understand that there is this entire history that is being omitted from the education system for both Indian and non-Indian students. And in order for them to really truly understand what the American dream should be, that is part of the story that needs to be told, and it's often left out.
You think of Indian people that have been on relocation and came back home. I think you come back home with a particular reason of, I want to be there, I want to be among my family, this is my home, I want to make it stronger, and so perhaps you come back with more courage, more determined to make things better. I've always been involved. I think we both, Stan and I, got involved in politics more at a grassroots level when we were students. I said colleges seem to kind of breed that, I think, in people.
We have to know the rules in order to compete. We're now becoming in a position where we can establish those rules and we can set those guidelines from which we operate.
In my role, I'm a state legislator now, and one of the things that I believe really strongly in is that Indian people have to be a part of the decision-making system that sets policy and that sets budget, not only at the tribal level, but they need to be on school boards. We need to be in county governments. We need to be in state governments. We can't have, I think, other people making those decisions for us any longer.
I'm optimistic about the future primarily because the generation that's following us and hopefully the generation after them are going to be knowledgeable about how to bring economic development to the reservation, how to create jobs, how to save the environment. We're starting to see some of that movement now.
Well, I think my life is already different. I mean, I think that they had learned the lessons of, hard times and growing up and being poor and having lots and lots of siblings and, watching their parents struggle through a lot of trying to come to terms with just raising a family and being able to be a part of the world where when I grew up, we were already a part of that world because they had gone through those experiences.
There's been progress made, probably, yes. But I do think that there's a lot of things that need to happen in terms of improving and providing better opportunities for Indian people. I think there's still a long ways to go on lots of things. Many of the reservation communities in Montana, particularly, are still some of the poorest communities in the nation. We need to be a part of the decision-making system that impacts us.
The legal issues that surround life on the reservation, everyday life, from religion to hunting to fishing, to how your government works, to how much government you can have, to the types of court systems you have on the reservation, all of those are somehow influenced or somehow limited or expanded by Congress and by laws. And that tension between the United States government and sovereign tribal nations will continue to be there as long as Indian tribes survive and as long as they continue on and continue doing their daily work. I think that there will be that tension. But I also think it's a good tension because I think that there needs to be the education process within that. And once people understand really that tribes are sovereign nations, that they are a distinct group in America, that they do have rights, and that can go a long ways too.
I think we've had years and years and years of outside governments, the BIA, saying this is what's best for Indian people, the relocation program, the Dawes Act, the Bureau boarding schools. But I think it's time for us to assume those power positions, not have the government trying to decide for us what's best for us any longer.